Steve Monsen earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Brigham Young University in agronomy and animal science, then pursued graduate study in botany and range science. In 1968, Monsen joined the USDA Forest Service's Intermountain Research Station at Provo, Utah, where he participated in many rangeland restoration projects until his retirement in 2002. During our August 2004 interview, Monsen spoke about the connection between long-term livestock grazing and the spread of weeds and Pinion-Juniper throughout the American West.
Unfortunately, to some extent, Pinion-Juniper occurs in a zone that was really, I think, abusively used by livestock initially with early settlement as well as has continued even through to today. Pinion-Juniper occurs in these foothill areas that we refer to as spring-fall ranges. And they're also critical for winter range sites for big game animals. And the livestock industry used these sites in the early spring as they came off of winter grazing areas, primarily in these west desert conditions. And animals would move from a wintering set of grazing issues where they were grazing shrubs and somewhat dry forage, and they would move into these foothills and these lowland sites early in the spring. And these sites obviously were the first sites to show any green life in the spring. So any amount of green up that occurred immediately attracted use, and animals just concentrated on those areas. And this included every form of a grazing animal. It wasn't just livestock, but it was particularly conducive to abuse by livestock, because livestock operators would come back to these areas year after year. And they had a tendency, not just a tendency, but they had an urgency to move on to those sites the minute any kind of green appeared, and they did. And then they never allowed them opportunity truly to get any amount of growth or size or vigor in the vegetation. Then in addition, these areas also were heavily used then in the fall by animals as they were brought back from high elevation rangelands from their summer grazing allotments. They were brought back then into the foothills and back towards ranching holdings and back toward the private land that was owned by ranching or by ranchers. And many of these ranches had Pinion-Juniper and related shrublands as part of their private holdings. Many of those did not go into federal ownership. So fall grazing on those sites was equally, destructive to some extent. If that wasn't enough, then these sites were the ones that really supported big game animals through the wintertime. And so south slopes and areas that would remain green or open in the winter that grew, and this was true in these areas, there was quite a diversity of species. There were many shrubs, and there were a number of what we call half shrubs that would grow up and produce quite a volume of material, but would die back down to ground level, but still had some woody nature to them. Things like we call buckwheat that were extremely valuable to big game in the wintertime. They would grow on these south and exposed slopes, and during periods of deep snow, they furnished excellent forage that could sustain big game animals through these critical 2 or 3 weeks or month period in the winter. So all of this use just concentrated on these foothill ranges where Pinion-Juniper was adapted. In addition, the loss of the understory reduced the incidence of fires. The grasses and the forbs that naturally grew in those areas did provide a fuel base for fires to ignite. And with the grazing, we lost that fuel component, and so fires that normally would have occurred in these areas just didn't happen. In addition, any fire that did occur, we were pretty aggressive in putting them out. There is evidence, and I can't speak to it very well, that some changes in climate may have caused some shift in trees, but at least in the areas that I've worked in the Great Basin, the Pinion-Juniper communities have been devastated by grazing. And as that happens, we've obviously then had a shift in composition of plants. And Pinion-Juniper were there on site, and they took advantage of that, and they have definitely increased in their areas of occupation. They are a native plant, and they do have areas that they naturally occur in, and obviously those sites and the density of trees is affected by natural fires. So there's considerable cycling that undoubtedly went on, and will continue to go on, but studies have clearly shown that Pinion-Juniper has increased dramatically in the last 100 to 150 years. There's a direct relationship that's been well established that as trees increase in biomass, the understory slowly diminishes. That includes the shrubs as well as the forbs as well as the grass complex. And as trees ultimately gain dominance, we lose the understory, even with grazing or without grazing. And the sad thing about this whole thing is that once you cross an early threshold, there is no way to reverse that unless you go in and intervene, physically intervene. And what we're now seeing and what we're realizing is that as these trees increase in density, and we get to the point where we have what we call closed stands, where the trees are touching one another, then the incidence of fires goes up dramatically, and the probability of burns increases significantly. In addition, those are pretty devastating fires, and they're sometimes not easy to contain and control. So we then move into a fire pattern that is really quite out of bounds. The other thing that has happened is cheatgrass and other weeds are well suited to the Pinion-Juniper sites. And cheatgrass particularly does invade these Pinion-Juniper stands and can exist with the trees in a scattered and very patchy pattern. You'll find cheatgrass kind of occurring around the halo of the trees or little interspaces and so on. And the distribution pattern is significant as well as the abundance of cheatgrass, because once the trees are removed or killed by fire, there's sufficient cheatgrass there for the site to immediately be transferred to cheatgrass. And that has happened and is continuing to happen, and is going to make very, very significant changes here in the West. And then the real kicker in this whole thing, though, that is scary, or that is the scariest issue for me, is that we now have weeds that are displacing cheatgrass that are much more serious than cheatgrass. And it's to be expected. Most of us have been taught, and you probably see it in your garden, that the first weed that's there is not the last one on the scene. And if you leave an area alone, you're going to have weeds invading weeds, and many of those situations are going to get progressively worse. And that is occurring in the Great Basin and throughout the West at an alarming rate. We have yellow star thistle, we have a number of knapweeds, we have skeleton weed in Idaho that is, in my career, I saw it when it probably occupied an area of 50 by 50 feet, and now it's across thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres. My fear is that the Pinion-Juniper woodlands are just the ideal sites for these weeds that are on the scene. They really are. If you look at the precip, the growing season, the soil conditions, and the community associations, the scary thing to me is that we're going to see our national parks like Zion and Bryce that are occupied by Pinion-Juniper, that to some extent are out of whack. We're going to see them transferred. I can tell you, in your lifetime, you're going to see them go to perennial weeds, and that's a scary issue, because how are we going to deal with those in national parks? Are we willing to go in there with equipment and herbicides? What are we going to do? And so that's why I'm really concerned about Pinion-Juniper woodlands, and I think we need to get aggressive with it. I think we need to understand what the heck is going on here, and we've got a window probably of 25 or, I don't know, maybe for 30 years or 50 years at the most, that we may have an opportunity to control this perennial weed invasion throughout much of the Great Basin. But it's fast closing in on us.